Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. Welcome to ACM and ACM Conversations, a series of monthly talks. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Louise. I'm the Assistant Curator of Chinese Art at the ACM. So welcome to ACM and ACM Conversations. This is a series of monthly talks where we bring together leading scholars, cultural practitioners, artisans, and community resource persons in Singapore and from abroad in conversation with curators and educators at ACM. This talk series would not be possible without the generous sponsorship of Royal Insignia, a premier luxury brand for medals, jewelry, and fine gifts for the world's royal families and international ministries. Today, we are honored to have Chris Hall with us to talk about his journey as a collector. Chris Hall has built up one of the most important collections of Asian textiles in the world, containing nearly 3,000 pieces. We at ACM are very fortunate to have displayed many of these works. He has generously donated the exquisite Japanese textiles that are on display at the newly opened special exhibition, Fukusa, Japanese gift covers from the Chris Hall collection, at the Peranakan Museum. Fukusa are gift covers that were used to exchange formal gifts in Edo, Meiji, and Taisho period Japan, and are some of the most spectacular examples of Japanese textile artistry. So this exhibition features over 80 Fukusa kimonos and related textiles, exploring them through the themes of trade, craft, and exchange, and the act of gifting across cultures. Now it is with much pleasure that I invite Chris and Kennie to begin the conversation to start the discussion today. There'll be time for questions afterwards, so please save them for later.
Thank you so very much, Louise. Louise also forgot to mention she's the lead curator for the Fukusa exhibition, and if you haven't already, I encourage you to take a look at the exhibition this weekend. So good afternoon, everybody. It's such a joy to see so many familiar faces in the crowd. It is also such a joy and privilege for me to be moderating the session with Chris Hall, who is really a little bit like he's like my idol, really, in many ways. So I'm so happy to have this conversation with him. I also want to say, thank you everybody for joining us today, because apparently tomorrow is ACM's birthday. I have it on my sort of work calendar. It's the 21st of April, so we turn 27 years old. Thank you for joining us, and thank Chris for being here on this occasion. So I thought that I would sort of start off this conversation first by having a chat with Chris about your collecting journey, and then we'll talk a little bit about the Fukusa exhibition, and then I'll open it up to the floor, because I'm sure everybody here has plenty of questions for Chris. But before I sort of start going with my questions, I wonder if, Chris, you wanted to say anything at all before we go into the...
I've got nothing to say now. Can you hear me? Good, excellent. I don't have anything to say now because I'll be saying far too much in the future, so it's over to you, Kennie.
Thank you so much, Chris. Okay, so my first question for you is this. You've said in the video we've done of you in the Fukusa exhibition that collecting is like an addiction. And of course, for any addiction, there was a sort of tipping point. So I want to ask you this. What was tipping point for you? Was there a precise moment in your life when you realized that you were going to be a collector? What happened to tip you over the edge, and how did you feel at the time?
I can't say that there was a tipping point. I just became more and more addicted. Now, I tell people that collectors are born. I mean, when I was a little boy, I collected plastic zoo animals, and the highlight of the week was when I could go to a nearby town and spend my pocket money on a few more plastic zoo animals. I still have those zoo animals today. I mean, I've invited friends to come and look at my collection of textiles, and sometimes they've brought their children, and the children have not been as nearly interested in the textiles as they ought to be. So what I've done is that I've brought out my collection of zoo animals, and they've been much more interested in those. Anyway, I then moved on to collecting history books. And then I sort of went to university. My collecting addiction lay dormant, mainly because I was studying hard and, more importantly, did not have the money to spend. But I later returned to Hong Kong, and I became entranced by textiles, and I started to buy them seriously. And after a few years, I realized that I was sort of spending a lot of money on textiles. My other main interest in life has been in taxation, because I was a very unusual child. Even as a schoolboy, it was my ambition to become a tax advisor. I doubt if there is anyone else in this room, or even in Singapore, who as a schoolboy had an ambition to be a tax advisor. But I subsequently became a chartered accountant, and then I specialized in taxation. But after a few years, I found that I was spending a lot of money on textiles. And I also realized I had a great opportunity to put together one of the great collections of Chinese textiles, which hadn't been done before. So it gradually dawned on me that my main role was as a collector of textiles rather than as a tax advisor.
Is there a confluence between the two? Has your career as a tax advisor colored your collecting? Are there sort of specific skill sets, ways of thinking that you feel are essential to your process or practice, so to speak, as a collector?
My career as a tax advisor is absolutely fundamental to my collecting textiles, because it provides the money to pay for them. But another aspect is also surprising, because as a tax advisor, I have to write about a very complicated subject to people who know nothing about tax, and I have to write in ways that they can understand. And when I was at school, I wrote many English essays as part of my English lessons, but I never thought that that taught me how to write. It was only when I became an accountant that I learnt to write properly. I remember when my accountancy exams were marked, I noticed that the marker would tick each paragraph. I, as an accountant, then realized that if I wrote more paragraphs, I get more ticks. But writing more paragraphs is an effort. But if you write shorter paragraphs and turn one paragraph into 2 paragraphs, you get 2 ticks. Now, this showed me one of the important facets of writing English, which is that short paragraphs are better than long paragraphs. Short sentences are better than long sentences, and short words are better than long words. I mean, it's not commonly realized that accountancy is the foundation of all literature. The earliest writing that you come across in the world in Mesopotamia, it's not poetry or prose, it's stock records. And if you think about it, this is natural, because people can remember thousands of lines of poetry, but have any of you ever tried to memorize stock records? It's extremely difficult. You need something to help you, which is why writing developed. So, as I said, it was my sort of writing as an accountant and a tax advisor that has helped me to be able to write well. And I now use that when I write about Chinese textiles, though I like to think that people enjoy my articles, mainly because there is some of my wit in the articles, and I like to think that my articles do not read like tax legislation.
Was there at any point in your collecting journey, a collector or collectors, whom you would see as a sort of role model for you?
The collector that I compare myself to is Sir Percival David, who has put together the great collection of ceramics, which is presently in the British Museum. I don't compare myself to Sir Percival because of his scholarship. He is a much greater scholar than I am. I also do not compare myself to Sir Percival because, well, in the way that he used to collect, because he used to pay the highest prices to the dealers so that they would bring the best pieces to him first. I certainly don't do that, to the great regret of the dealers who sell to me. They wish I wouldn't negotiate quite so hard. Why I compare myself to Sir Percival is because, like him, I have spent much of my income on textiles. Sir Percival inherited a large fortune, and he spent most of it on his collection of Chinese porcelain, so that he ended up in a flat provided by the University of London. I did not inherit a large fortune, and as a sensible accountant, I have not impoverished myself in financing my collection, but I still spend much of my income on textiles. And when I returned to Hong Kong, I moved in with my parents. My mother was not best pleased to hear that I was much more influenced by the fact that my parents had a full-time armour, as opposed to seeing my parents again after an absence of several years. My mother very meanly insisted that I had to pay $100 a month to cover rent and board. I objected, but she was very stern. My one success was that in the 25 years that I lived with my parents, I was able to prevent her from increasing the monthly charge. So this sort of left me with a lot of free money, which I have been able to spend on my textile collection.
Let's talk a bit about how you choose the pieces that you collect. You mentioned a few times that the wow factor is key for you when you decide to acquire a piece. So how would you define wow?
I think I would define wow is that when I see a piece, I have to have it. Now, last October, there was the antique fair in Hong Kong. I went to it without much hope because the foreign dealers have not yet returned to Hong Kong. We're hoping to see them later this year. But while I was there, I saw a magnificent tanka. It's a picture of a Buddhist deity. It was about 600 years old, over 600 years old. And it was the finest tapestry weave I've seen. It was really magnificent. And I immediately decided to buy it. The only problem was that I was heavily in debt. I already owed a lot of money to another dealer. But I'm pleased to say that I scraped together enough money to pay a deposit, and it's now part of my collection. So I think that is really sort of the wow factor. But if you look, say, more scientifically at the wow factor, I would be looking at rarity, beauty, condition, and age.
You have also mentioned in interviews that you love color. And I wanted to ask you, what is the most sort of over-the-top, colorful piece in your collection, and why do you love it?
Well, I mean, one of the contenders is the Fukusa of the game of Go, which I think is appearing behind me, yes, which is very colorful. Now, I love color, and as you can see from the way I dress. And I tell people that when it comes to colour, you should not restrain yourselves. Now, when you decorate your home, if you put absolutely every colour in a room, then whatever else you acquire will go with something. It is only if you try to have a colour scheme and restrict yourself that you have problems matching colours.
So you talked a little bit about your sort of style. Which piece in your collection do you most dream of wearing, and where would you wear this to?
Well, I'm afraid I'll have to answer this in the negative because I don't dream of wearing my collection. I mean, the dragon robes are magnificent, but in order to wear a dragon robe, one should pass the very difficult official exams in order to become an official, and I haven't passed those exams. If I put on a dragon robe, I would feel like a millionaire who has a painting done of himself wearing the robes of a member of the House of Lords in Britain. I would feel a fraud. I remember on one occasion I was invited to a party where we had to dress up as guests of the Kangxi Emperor. I cheated because I came along in a late 19th century velvet man's robe. And what I do remember about that evening was that I ate and drank nothing all evening for fear of spilling something. So it was not the jolliest party I ever attended. I do remember that one of my friends, a dealer, Jacqueline Simcox, was at the party. She was wearing a beautiful lady's robe from the late 19th century, and she was drinking wine. But how she did it was like this. I don't think she had a very comfortable evening either. But it can be fun to wear the robes. I remember on another occasion, two dealers, Stephen McGuinness and Linda Wrigglesworth, had put together a collection of Chinese textiles. And at the end of it, Stephen got dressed up in an empress robe and Linda got dressed up in an empress robes. And they had photos taken of them. And it was great fun.
What are the most surprising or unexpected pieces in the Chris Hall collection?
Well, I have quite a few surprises. But what I will talk about is that on one occasion, a well-known specialist in Chinese porcelain came to my flat, and I told him that I would show him two pieces of porcelain that he had never seen. Now, the first is coming up on the screen, and I suspect that many of you have never seen anything like this. Now, this is a strainer for dyeing. Now, when you put the silk thread in the dye, you should not pick it up, because if you pick it up, you will remove some of the dye and it will not look so good. So you need a strainer like this with holes in the bottom. This strainer, in fact, is very small. It's about the size of my microphone. And it would have been used for very expensive dye. So you put the thread in the strainer, you then dip the strainer in the dye, and when the thread has absorbed the dye, you remove the strainer and then wait until the thread has dried. So this is one of the unusual items. And then next, you can now see a dye can. And this is quite an unusual dye can because in the second half of the 19th century, they developed chemical dyes and new colors appeared for the first time, which got the textile people very excited. This dye can comes from a German company. It has a picture of the German emperor and empress Kaiser bill, but it also has Chinese characters on it. So this was made in Germany for export to China. Then the other porcelain that Peter Lamb had never seen before was a tortoise, and here is a tortoise. Now, you may not recognize this as a tortoise, but when I tell you that the tortoise is the man who takes the prostitute to her next client, you may understand, because I believe that the Chinese word for tortoise has some similarity. Now, again, Peter Lamb had never seen this tortoise, and obviously the man here, you can tell he enjoys his job from the big smile he has on his face. And then if we move on to the next item, now this is a prostitute's apron. Now, this is a sort of a dodo. It looks very demure, but if you lift up the flap, this is what you see. We now have 4 beautifully painted pictures of amorous couples. My favorite here is the one, well, it's the one on my left at the bottom, where the lady is naked except for her gentleman admirer's trilby hat, which was very fashionable for a Chinese gentleman in the early 20th century.
With that, let's move on to the Fukusa and Japanese textile collection.
Yeah.
So we know the story of how a visit to the Mandarin Oriental in Hong Kong inspired you to start collecting Chinese textiles. What was the inspiration for collecting Japanese textiles for you?
Well, well, I think if you put the next one on on the screen. Now, I used to work on Saturday mornings in order to catch up. And then in the afternoons, I would go to the Plum Blossoms Gallery. This was in the 1980s, when wonderful new Chinese textiles were appearing every month. And on one occasion, I saw nearby a new gallery had opened, and there were beautiful embroideries on the wall. It was not very inviting. The door was barely open, and it was also blocked by a bucket. But undaunted in my search of textiles, I stepped across the bucket to be told that the gallery was not open. I was told it would open next week and I should come back next week. But I pleaded, I said, I'm going on holiday next week, I won't be here, I would like to buy this textile. And the lady relented and she sold it to me. And here you can see it. And I particularly like this Fukusa. Well, it's very cheerful with the 3 laughing men, but it's based on a story. There was a monk in a monastery who took a vow that he would never leave the boundary of the monastery. 2 friends decided to play a trick on him, and they visited him and they engaged him in such an enthralling conversation that he came to the edge of the monastery and then walked across the bridge and was therefore outside the boundary of the monastery. The friends, laughing, pointed out to him what he had done, and he then joined them in the joke. Now, this monk was, a much more sort of conciliatory person than I would have been on that occasion to have been tricked. But anyway, it's a fun story.
Just to point out that this, the image of this piece is actually when we were viewing the piece at Chris's apartment some time back already, and it was really such joy, sort of, looking through all of the Fukusa pieces. This piece is, of course, in the exhibition, so please do look out for it when you go see it. Now, my next question. Do you look for different details or have a different criteria when you're collecting Japanese as opposed to Chinese textiles?
Not really. I mean, I mainly look for the same qualities of rarity, beauty, condition, and age. I've also been heavily focused on the Fukusa. I've bought many more Fukusa than anything else in Japanese.
Let's talk about the exhibition itself. Is there one piece that you're very fond of in the exhibition, and why?
Yes, one of the pieces I'm very fond of is the one that you can see, because this is not only a magnificent Fukusa, it's very typical of what Fukusa should be. You can see all the gold thread on it, so it is a lavish display of wealth, but it is more than that, because it also shows the education and refinement of the giver, and it was expected that the receiver of the gift would also understand the reference. Now, this here is Hagoromo. Now, there was a celestial fairy came down from the moon, and I understand it's quite a long journey, so she was probably a bit sweaty after that journey, and she came to a beautiful beach and decided to have a swim. Water is not really good for feathers, so if she wanted to fly back to the moon, she didn't want to, get the feathers wet, so she removed her feather cape. A fisherman came along and got the cape. This distressed the fairy, who pleaded to get the cape back again. But the fisherman insisted that he would only return the feather cape if the fairy danced for him. The books do not say what else the fisherman insisted that the fairy did with him, but I will pass over that.
I also want to point out that this beautiful piece is actually the first piece you would see in the exhibition, and we've lit it, as best as we could, so it's like a golden sort of floating nimbus that draws you into the show. Let's talk more about the Fukusa. Tell us a curious, interesting, or humorous story behind one of these pieces in terms of how it came into your collection.
Yes. Well, in fact, this is not one of the pieces that you will see. But I was invited by some friends to dinner one evening, and when I arrived, I was surprised. I was not presented with a glass of wine as expected. Instead, I was presented with some designs for an obi. I mean, the obi is the large sash that is worn on kimono. My host, Mr. Kinoshita, explained to me that his grandfather had designed obis, and to my surprise, these obi designs were pressed on me as a gift. These have now been given, and they are now part of the collection of the Asian Civilisations Museum. One of the problems that many families have is that we have things of value that we just don't know what to do with, and we need to find a home for them. My home has ended up becoming a home for many of these things, but I have no complaints about that, because I am not one of the party who believes that it is more blessed to give than to receive.
I think you've mentioned before that your mother was always more supportive of your collecting journey. Which piece in the exhibition do you think your mother would have liked the most?
That's easy to answer. I think it would have been none of them. In fact, my mother was only more supportive of my collection than my father, because her comments about my undesirable habit of collecting were rather less strong. I remember displaying a Ming Dynasty Buddhist kesa, about 10 foot long. It was so big, I couldn't display it in my bedroom. I had to display it in my parents' bedroom, spread out over my parents' bed. When my father saw it, he said, "Take that dirty rag off my bed." Well, should we say, I mean, unfortunately, being about 500, 600 years old, it was stained and it was past its best, but I would say in its defense that it looked considerably better than I will look in 500 years' time. As I said, my mother's criticism was only just less intense. My mother believed in property. She bullied my father until he reluctantly agreed to buy a flat in Hong Kong. And this was why my parents were able to retire there. I mean, my father was provided with very, very adequate accommodation by his job, but it was my mother who was the foresighted one. My mother also encouraged me to spend my money on sensible things like property, and she lent me money to buy a house in London. And when she lent me the money, she told me that I should stop being stupid and should no longer buy any more textiles, but should just save my money up to buy property. I, being a good son, a good Asian son, did not disagree with her. I just said nothing. But my mother was a very clever woman, and when she saw me come back into the flat in later months and later years with a bag full of shopping, she never asked what was inside. So we had no disagreements with my mother about my no longer collecting textiles. And when about 10, 20 years later, my mother learnt that I had one of the best collections of Chinese textiles in the world, she took it as a matter of pride and didn't question me as how I acquired it without spending any money.
I have just one last question about the about Japanese textiles, and that's just a general question about what your thoughts are about the exhibition that we have.
Well, I think what is most impressive about the exhibition is the lighting. I mean, each of the pieces is beautifully lit. It's in a dark. It's in a dark room, but each textile is highlighted. I mean, if you go through the Peranakan museum, you can see there is a sort of a general light. So when you go into the room, the individual items are not highlighted. But in the exhibition of the Fukusa, each Fukusa is beautifully spotlighted, and you can really enjoy it and appreciate it.
Yay, thank you. I have questions actually about Chris's life in Hong Kong, but I'm going to hold on those because I think it might be good to get some questions from the floor. May I ask the audience has any questions? And if you could sort of just identify yourself, just tell us what your name is before you ask the question. That would be lovely. Yes, please. Yes.
Well, Ida Chow. Actually, I do know Chris. When you started collecting in the 80s in Hong Kong, it was a very fortuitous time because there was a very good supply of textiles coming in from China.
Yes.
But now in the 21st century, the source has dried up. So how do you go about adding to your collection now in the 21st century?
It's not difficult because if you've got money to spend, people bring textiles to you. Unfortunately, the prices have gone up so much, they've gone up 10 times. So, I mean, when I started, I could afford to buy virtually anything. Now, what cost $10,000 in the 80s is now $100,000. But there is still sufficient supply to keep me permanently in debt. But I tell people that the great thing about being in debt is that the more people that you owe money to, the more people who are genuinely concerned about your health.
Another question from the floor? Yes, please, a lady in front.
Hi, I'm Sandy Young, and my question is regards to some of your ideas on conservation of textile. In particular, you said you look for condition, but you've also referred to one item that was not in perhaps best condition after 600 years. So your ideas on conservation, or restoration and preservation?
Well, the basic idea to preserve textiles is you shouldn't use them. Now, if you've got a beautiful dress, the best way to preserve it is not to wear it. Every time you wear your clothes, they will fade a little. I suppose you could say, textiles are like human beings. It's inevitable that they get older. Essentially, how I deal with them, I do not display textiles in my home. If you do display them, you need to keep them out of the light. Sunlight is an absolute no-no. I have seen textiles, beautiful textiles, on display in Chinese museums, and after 6 months they've faded, they're gone. Once a textile has lost color, you cannot bring it back, unfortunately. You can clean textiles. If the embroidery becomes loose, you can bring the embroidery back. But once the color goes, it's gone. So I sort of keep the textiles in drawers out of the light. And in a climate control conditions, Hong Kong and Singapore are similar. They are not good places to keep textiles because of the humidity. But with sort of 24-hour air conditioning, that overcomes the problem.
One question at the back.
Thank you. Hi, sorry, my name is Perrine. I just wanted to know, looking back, is there anything you wish you had done differently, or any tips for anyone on how you would tackle starting a collection?
What was the first question again? You said, looking back, what?
Yeah, is there anything you wish you'd done differently?
Well, there's the two questions. Well, I think sort of tips for young collectors. I think Fukusa are a good thing to collect. They're not expensive. I think you can buy very nice Fukusa for $2,000 or $3,000 US. That is not small money, but when you compare it that nice pieces of Chinese porcelain are 2 or 3 million US dollars, it does put it in context. Another thing that can be collected, which is not so expensive, is cheongsam of the 20th century. They have not yet become particularly expensive. Of course, another important thing is the best thing is to study the items as much as possible. And I suppose what is really important is to actually like the items. Then about what would I have wished to have done differently? There are so many wonderful textiles that I didn't buy that escaped me. So I have so many regrets. The problem is that, of course, if I'd spent the money on those textiles, I couldn't have afforded something else. I suppose a big problem I had is when I started collecting Chinese textiles, you could easily buy a 12-symbol imperial robe for $10,000 US. Now, a similar robe will cost you about $200,000 US or more. So I focused on collecting Ming pieces, which are older and much rarer. but they have gone up in price much less than the imperial robes.
Any other questions? Yes, please, the gentleman.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your very interesting talk and very entertaining and amusing with all your anecdotes. Just one question, and that is, what would you advise a future Chris Hall? If there's somebody who is interested in, becoming a future Chris Hall.
A future collector.
Yeah, future collector.
Okay.
Well, Chris Hall, future Chris Hall is good. It's very good.
Future, okay, yes.
Yeah,
well,
what do you advise? I mean, money is, of course, the most overpowering
okay, yes.
factor. And yeah, but
Okay.
what else? What else?
What else?
Yeah, thank you.
Well, there are two fatal mistakes to avoid. The first is to get married. Unless, of course, your spouse is the child of a very wealthy millionaire, and preferably not only a very wealthy millionaire, but a very elderly millionaire in bad health. I mean, there are exceptions. The second mistake, which is even more important to avoid, is don't have children. Because, should we say, the amount that you spend on your spouse is probably tiny compared to the amount that you will spend on your children.
Oh, yes, another question.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Oksana. So talking about family,
Yes.
To which extent you think the unsupportive comments from your parents lit up your passion to collect?
I can't really comment. I just ignored them, which I assume is not unusual. I mean, how many children pay attention to what their parents tell them?
I think, well, we might have a few more questions, but I wonder, Chris, it's all right that I ask you a couple of questions about your life in Hong Kong, because I think that might be very, very amusing. So, Hong Kong. You've flown in here from Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a city that's very close to our hearts here in Singapore. We're kind of like sister cities. What do you love about the city? What are your fondest memories there? What are your favorite places?
Well, I mean, what I really like about Hong Kong is it's so beautiful and everything is so convenient. Now, I live in a beautiful flat up on the peak in Hong Kong, and I have a beautiful view down to the South China Sea. But what is so amazing about the flat and what is so amazing about Hong Kong is that I am only 6 minutes drive away from the central business district, which is full of world-class restaurants, I mean cinemas, theaters, I mean all the life of an international city. Well, also only 6 minutes away from the antique shops. And if we go on to the next picture, I mean, here I am walking in the mountains. I am just about 20 minutes walk away from my flat. And where else in the world can you live 6 minutes drive from the central business district and to be somewhere like this? So that, I think, is the great beauty and convenience of Hong Kong. Now, because I remember when I was 5 years old in Hong Kong, I remember being perfectly happy, having no problems at all. I mean, that was one time in my life when I was perfectly happy. But that, of course, was before I was sent off to boarding school and then had to start to earn a living. I think one of the questions you were going to ask is, where is my favorite place in Hong Kong? And my favorite place is my home. I don't know if we have a picture of my home.
We don't have one here.
Okay, no, okay. But my home, sort of being a bachelor, I've been able to decorate my home in the way that I want. I have not had to make any compromises. And I have filled my home with antiques because it gives me a certain pleasure to think that I am the youngest thing in my flat. Gives me a pleasure to think.
What's an average day like in the life of Chris Hall in Hong Kong?
Well, my average day, because it would be to go to the office, being addicted to antiques, I need the money to support my addictions. So I'm still working. So the day would be spent in the office, and then in the evening I would go for dinner with friends or to a lecture. I also go to the gym, but I make the gym exciting because while on the treadmill, I watch a DVD. And during COVID, when there was semi-lockdown and there was nothing else to do, I would go to the gym 2 or 3 times a week. And as a consequence, I was able to watch each of the 44 episodes of Game of Thrones. I frequently have dinner parties. I normally have people for dinner once or twice a week. It's very easy giving dinner parties when you have a full-time helper to do all the work. And what is particularly pleasing about the dinner parties is that your helper does the work and you get the credit. But I don't make life easy for my guests because I impose a dress code of suit and tie. One of my guests had to go out and actually buy a suit and tie before he could come to dinner. But ladies have beautiful dresses, and today casual wear is so common that the ladies almost never get an opportunity to wear their beautiful clothes, except perhaps like at opening parties at the Asian Civilisations Museum. So my dinner parties do provide an opportunity for the ladies to bring out their beautiful clothes that they haven't had an opportunity to wear. But life is not all fun. Part of the human condition is that by the time you reach your 60s, you'll have 3 chronic conditions. And by the time you get to your 70s, you'll have even more. So that the life of an old man like myself means that I have to make several visits to the doctor every month for the endless succession of tests that one has to have to check up on the rate of deterioration of the various parts of the body. When I enter the surgery of a new doctor, I feel that he can see money walking through the door. He can see money.
We briefly spoke about your apartment. I'm very sorry. I should have thought of putting a photo of it here because, it was once very sort of fabulously featured in a coffee table book that was titled Chateau Chris Hall, and I encourage you to sort of hunt it down. It's fiendishly hard to find, but you can find images of it online. What would you say is your approach and philosophy to interior decorating? You sort of talked a bit about it, but...
Well, I told you about the first Fukusa I saw and the lady running the gallery. Her name was Mary Deeming, and we became very close friends. And when I bought my flat in Hong Kong, she said she would go help me to decorate it. Now, she was inspired by Japanese art, and she told me that less is more. I told her that I'm an accountant. I think more is more. My approach is I love to have colour, and there are no white walls in my apartment, and I love decoration. So the more decoration, the better.
What work of art or antique or piece of furniture in your apartment are you most fond of, and why?
Well, I won't. It's difficult for me to choose the one I'm most fond of, but I will tell you the story of the piece that was most difficult to bring into my apartment, and it's this ivory table. I bought it in London, and I got a CITES certificate to allow export of ivory from Britain. But the UK Customs wanted to do a special investigation, and because of the special investigation, the table missed its shipping date. So it was put on the next ship. But even though the customs did a special investigation, they didn't notice that when they signed the CITES certificate, it was 6 days after the expiry date. So when the ivory table arrived in Hong Kong, the CITES certificate was no longer valid, and it became an illegal export. Well, an illegal import. But the Hong Kong authorities said, look, if you can get a replacement CITES certificate, we can let it in. So I applied to the British CITES authorities, and they said, no, it's outside our jurisdiction now, not our problem. So I then went to a lawyer who pointed out to the UK customs people that under the European Union regulations, and Britain was part of the European Union then, it is possible to issue a replacement certificate if the owner has not committed an irregularity. The UK customs then came back and said, you have committed an irregularity because you submitted the CITES certificate 3 weeks before the deadline, which did not give us enough time to deal with it. We said, well, how can you say that submitting documentation is 3 weeks before the deadline is an irregularity when you signed the document 6 days after the expiry of the certificate? I mean, if you had noticed the date, you could have told us and we could have applied for another certificate. They said that was not an irregularity because you cannot expect a government department to read the documents that it signs. My lawyer then wrote back and said, that is absolute nonsense. And said, look, this is all nonsense. But then the CITES office said, okay, we make no comment on what the border force did in signing the certificate 6 days after the expiry date. Our department did nothing wrong, and we're not going to issue a replacement certificate. So after all of that, I then had to get back to the Hong Kong people who said we tried to get a replacement certificate from the British, but they wouldn't issue one. This then meant, this caused a huge problem for the bureaucrats in the Agriculture and Fisheries Department, because it meant that they might have to make a decision. Anyway, they then came up with a brilliant idea. They said, they referred it to the Justice Department and said, look, we will take the matter to court. Let the courts decide so we don't have to make a decision. When the Justice Department saw this case of, should we say, the various problems I'd had, and that I mean, I was not at fault at all in any way. They didn't want to handle it, so they passed it back to the Agriculture and Fisheries Department. So this, when called upon Plan B, put the file in the pending tray and hope that you are transferred to another department before a decision has to be made. So it dragged on like this for a year or so. And then I got another lawyer, a smart young lawyer, who then telephoned the Agriculture and Fisheries Department and said that he was planning to take legal action against the department for unreasonably withholding the table from me for an unreasonable length of time. Disaster. A decision had to be made. Anyway, what they then came up with, there was then a telephone call from the department to my lawyer, who then said, well, now Mr. Hall is not a dealer. He's not planning to resell the item, and he's planning to give all of his collection to museums. Now, would Mr. Hall sign an affidavit to this effect that he won't resell the item and that he will give it to a museum, and then we will release it to him? So that was the eventual compromise. And after 5 years, the table is now in my flat, and the table was made to put a hooker, a smoking hooker on. And there is something special about the table, which I cannot show up on the screen. Kennie will be relieved to hear this, in that on the top of the table is very faintly etched on it, is 2 naked ladies.
I'm just going to ask 2 more questions, and then maybe I'll just kind of I'll open it back to the floor again. What would you describe as your personal sartorial style?
Well, I would call my style as colourful classic. I tell people that I am on a one-man campaign to restore the natural order. If you look at nature, you will see that the male of the species is magnificently adorned, not the female. I mean, you look at the peacock, not at the peahen. I mean, Homo sapiens has got it completely wrong. I mean, the ladies are beautifully dressed, and the clothes that most men wear are not worthwhile looking at. I'm pleased to say that Kennie is a good exception. Part of the man I blame for this unfortunate state of affairs is Beau Brummel. I don't know, he is a famous English dandy of the early 19th century. He had some ridiculous ideas. I mean, one of his sayings is that the art of elegance is not to be noticed. I completely disagree. Another thing that he said was that the only colours a man should wear are black, white, and beige. Both Kennie and I disagree on that as well.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I have one last question before I once again sort of throw it to the floor. What is your favourite museum in the world?
Yes. Well, I will probably cause upset here. My favourite museum is the Victoria and Albert in Britain.
Yay! I love the museum too.
Because I love the decorative arts. And it also has clothing, and I remember I went to a very interesting exhibition there of underwear, of ladies' underwear. In fact, in my collection of Chinese textiles, I was talking to a curator who was absolutely fascinated by, one of the things that I do have that, I mean, the Palace Museum in Beijing has the world's best collection of court costume in the world. But I have something that they do not have, which is underwear. But when you think about it, it's only when, should we say, when Granny dies, all her, all her textiles get thrown away. It's only, say, the wedding dresses and things like that that get kept. So if you want to collect 21st century textiles that will become very rare in the future, don't collect wedding dresses. What you should be collecting are Marks and Spencer's gentlemen's underpants.
All right. We're actually coming up to time, but I just wanted to ask if there are any sort of burning questions from the floor at all. Yes, lady in the middle.
Thank you, Chris. I'm curious, in your collection, do you have particular items that particularly, on account of the backstory, salacious, notorious, or, you know?
Notorious? I'm afraid I don't have that many salacious textiles. The prostitute's apron that you saw has been exhibited in the Museum of Sex in New York, where they had a special exhibition of Chinese erotica. I mean, by and large, it was very tame. I mean, the largest exhibit was all the bound-foot shoes, because, should we say, a pornographic picture in the past of China, you would have a bed covered with curtains, but you would have and the lady, all that you would see would be a lady would be sticking out her bound foot, beautifully covered in an embroidered lotus shoe. I've recently acquired something that is notorious. I've bought a table frontal, an embroidered table frontal on my last trip to Beijing from the 1930s. It was given to a famous singer whose name I have forgotten, but it was given to him by the head of the Shanghai police, whom some unkind people have suggested may have been corrupt, just because his brother was in charge of the Shanghai triads. And this table frontal was very useful for the singer, because he could then hang it up at his concerts. And because it had the name of the police chief on it, it showed that he was protected.
I think that we have run out of time. Thank you so much to Chris once again for sharing so candidly about his collecting journey and his life in Hong Kong. Thank you also to the audience for being so active with your questions. And I'm just going to hand it back to Louise for now for some last words.
Okay. Thank you once again, Chris and Kennie, for this really engaging and illuminating session. And thank you everyone for coming today. So